There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from standing in a crowded room while everyone else is dancing. For Eliza Morton, that feeling had become all too familiar. At 31, she'd made peace with standing along the wall at town dances, quietly watching other women twirl across the floor. Then Caleb Vance walked in, a man with a dark past and a reputation that made grown men step aside. When he crossed that floor and asked her to dance, everything changed. He was the last man anyone expected to choose her, and she was the last woman anyone thought he'd notice. What happens when two people who've spent years convinced they don't deserve love finally take a chance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Eliza Morton's shop on Main Street, casting delicate patterns across bolts of fabric stacked against the wall. She sat at her work table, a sterling silver needle moving through cream-colored silk with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd been stitching since childhood. The needle had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of seamstresses, its surface worn smooth by countless hours of careful work. In Eliza's hands, it moved like an extension of her own fingers, each stitch precise and even. Cedar Ridge, Montana wasn't much more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered along a single main road, with perhaps 800 souls calling it home. The town sat in a valley surrounded by pine-covered mountains that turned purple at sunset, and in autumn the aspens blazed gold against the evergreens like scattered coins. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the church bell marked the hours, and where traditions ran as deep as the roots of the old cottonwoods lining Cedar Creek. Eliza had lived here all her life. She'd grown up in a small house at the edge of town, the eldest child of Robert and Ann Morton. Her father had worked at the sawmill. Her mother had taken in laundry, and together they'd built a modest but loving home. Eliza had learned to sew at her mother's knee, discovering early that she had a gift for it, an eye for proportion, a sense of how fabric should fall, how colors should complement one another. Then, when Eliza was 19 and her brother Thomas was only 12, influenza swept through Cedar Ridge like a cold wind. Within 2 weeks, both her parents were gone, buried side by side in the cemetery on the hill. The house fell to Eliza, along with the responsibility of raising her younger brother. She'd set aside her own dreams, vague notions of moving to Helena or even Denver, opening a proper dress shop in a city where fashion mattered, and instead poured everything into keeping Thomas fed, clothed, and in school. She'd worked out of their home at first, taking in mending and simple alterations. But Eliza had talent that couldn't be hidden, and word spread. Within 3 years, she'd saved enough to rent the small shop on Main Street, the one with the large front window and good natural light. She painted the sign herself, Morton's Tailoring and Dress Goods. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. Thomas had left for college in Missoula 2 years ago, a scholarship student studying engineering. Eliza had stood on the train platform, waving, until the locomotive disappeared around the bend, feeling both proud and utterly bereft. She'd given 12 years to raising him, and she'd do it again without hesitation. But standing there alone, watching the steam dissipate into the mountain air, she'd felt the weight of all the years she'd spent caring for everyone else. At 31, Eliza had become a fixture in Cedar Ridge. She was the woman you went to when you needed a wedding dress or a suit for a funeral, when you needed curtains hemmed or a quilt repaired. She had capable hands and a kind smile, auburn hair she kept pinned back in a practical bun, and green eyes that people said were striking when they bothered to look closely. Most didn't. She'd become part of the scenery, reliable and unremarkable, like the post office or the general store. She'd attended the town dances, of course. At first, in her early 20s, she'd gone with hope that some young man might notice her, might see past the girl who smelled of thread and fabric dye. But the eligible men married other women who didn't have the weight of responsibility settling over them like dust. Then she'd gone out of obligation because Cedar Ridge was small and everyone was expected to participate in community events. And finally, she'd gone because not going would invite questions she didn't want to answer, pity she couldn't bear to receive. So Eliza had learned to stand along the wall, to clap politely when others danced, to decline invitations to play cards in the corner with the other unattached women. She'd made her peace with it, or told herself she had. Love, she'd decided, was for other people. She had her work, her shop, her independence. It would be enough. The town's other residents had their own stories, their own griefs and small triumphs. Margaret Whitfield, the schoolteacher, was Eliza's closest friend, a practical woman of 35 who'd never married and claimed to prefer it that way. Old Mrs. Patterson lived alone since her husband died, struggling with packages and stairs. The Henshaw family ran the bank and acted as if they owned half the town, which they nearly did. Deputy Tom Brennan kept the peace with more swagger than necessary, still trying to live up to his father's reputation as sheriff. And then there was Caleb Vance, everyone in Cedar Ridge had an opinion about Caleb Vance. He'd appeared 3 years ago with a bank draft and a hard face, buying the struggling Thornhill Ranch from the widow who couldn't manage it alone. The ranch sat 5 miles outside town, accessible by a rough road that wound through pine forest and across 2 creek crossings. It had good grazing land, a sturdy barn, and a small house that needed work. But it wasn't Caleb's arrival that had set tongues wagging, it was his past. Word traveled fast in small towns, and within a week everyone knew. Caleb Vance had served 5 years in the territorial prison in Deer Lodge for armed robbery. He'd ridden with a gang of outlaws in his 20s, desperate men who'd held up stages and remote homesteads. During one robbery, a territorial marshal had been shot, not killed but badly wounded. Caleb had turned himself in rather than run, had stood trial and accepted his sentence without complaint. 5 years. 5 years of hard labor, breaking rocks and working in the prison workshop. He'd emerged thinner, harder, with eyes that had seen things decent people didn't speak of. He'd saved every cent of his wages, had somehow secured a loan from a bank in Helena, and had bought the ranch with the single-minded determination of a man trying to build something from nothing. The town didn't know what to make of him. Some folks crossed the street when they saw him coming. Others nodded curtly and moved on. The shopkeepers took his money. Business was business, but their smiles were tight, their conversations brief. Caleb didn't seem to expect anything different. He kept to himself, worked his ranch from dawn to dusk, and came to town only when necessary. Eliza had seen him, of course. Cedar Ridge was too small for anonymity. She'd noticed him at the general store, buying supplies with cash he counted carefully. She'd seen him waiting outside the feed and grain, his wagon loaded with fence posts. Once she'd watched from her shop window as he'd helped old Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries home. His manner gentle despite his rough appearance. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and hard living. He was 36, according to town gossip, though he looked older. There was a weariness about him, a careful way he moved through the world, as if always conscious of the space he occupied and the reaction he provoked. Eliza had never spoken to him. Their worlds didn't intersect. She was the respectable seamstress. He was the former outlaw, trying to scratch out a living on marginal land. What would they have to say to each other? The harvest dance was Cedar Ridge's most anticipated social event of the year, a tradition that stretched back 40 years. It was held in the town hall on the last Saturday in October, after the crops were in and before winter closed down the mountain passes. Everyone came, farmers and shopkeepers, families and sweethearts, old folks who sat along the walls, and young people who danced until their feet hurt. Margaret had stopped by the shop that afternoon, her eyes bright with the particular excitement that preceded community gatherings. "You're coming tonight, aren't you?" she'd asked, though it wasn't really a question. In Cedar Ridge, you attended the harvest dance unless you were ill or in mourning. Of course, Eliza had replied, her needle never pausing in its work, Good. I heard Jacob Thompson's cousin is visiting from Butte. He's unmarried, apparently quite successful. Margaret's voice carried the forced optimism of someone trying to be helpful. Eliza had smiled, a practiced expression that revealed nothing. That's nice. They both knew how it would go. Eliza would arrive, would make polite conversation, would stand along the wall while couples filled the dance floor. Maybe someone would ask her to dance, one of the older gentlemen being courteous, or a young man put up to it by his mother. She'd accept gracefully, would make it through one song without stepping on his feet, and then she'd return to her spot along the wall. It was fine. She'd made her peace with it. That evening Eliza had taken care with her appearance. She'd sewn herself a new dress specifically for the dance, a deep blue cotton with a modest neckline and fitted waist. The color brought out the green in her eyes, and the cut was flattering without being immodest. She'd let her hair down, brushing it until it shone, then pinning it up in a softer style than her usual practical bun. Standing before her small mirror, she'd studied her reflection. Not beautiful, perhaps, but not plain either. Presentable, respectable, alone. The walk to the town hall took only 10 minutes. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the first hint of coming snow. The mountains stood dark against a sky, still holding the last light of day, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter and walked on. The town hall was already alive with music and laughter when she arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light across the wooden floor that had been waxed for the occasion. The band, 3 fiddles, a guitar, and old Samuel Hutchins on his battered accordion, had launched into a lively reel. Couples spun and turned, their faces flushed with exertion and joy. Eliza found her usual spot along the east wall, between the punch table and the door to the cloakroom. From here she could see the entire room. She recognized everyone, of course. There were the Hendersons with their 3 teenage daughters, all popular dancing partners. The Henshaw family held court near the front, Mrs. Henshaw's elaborate hat bobbing as she surveyed the gathering with proprietary satisfaction. Margaret stood with a group of other unmarried women, laughing at something one of them had said. An hour passed in the familiar rhythm of observation. Eliza clapped when the music warranted it, smiled when someone caught her eye, accepted a cup of punch from Margaret when she brought one over. She was present without truly being there, a ghost haunting her own life. Then the doors opened and Caleb Vance walked in. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they faltered, resumed at a different pitch. Heads turned, then quickly turned away. The dancers kept dancing, but there was a new awareness in the room, a current of tension that hadn't existed moments before. Caleb stood just inside the doorway, his hat in his hands. He'd made an effort, that much was clear. His shirt was clean, his hair freshly cut, his boots polished. But he still wore those worn leather gloves he never seemed to remove in public. And his face carried that same guarded expression Eliza had seen from afar. He didn't approach the punch table or attempt to join any of the clusters of conversation. He simply stood there alone in a crowded room, and Eliza felt something shift in her chest. She knew that feeling. She lived that feeling. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment everything else seemed to recede. Eliza felt her breath catch. She'd been looked at before, certainly, but this was different. Caleb Vance was looking at her as if he'd come to this dance for one specific purpose, and she was it. He moved through the crowd with surprising grace for such a large man. People stepped aside, some deliberately, others instinctively, creating a path that led directly to where Eliza stood against the wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Surely he was heading somewhere else. Surely he wasn't actually walking toward her, but he was. Conversations died in his wake. The music continued, but Eliza was aware of dozens of eyes watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The former outlaw and the spinster seamstress. What could he possibly want with her? Caleb stopped directly in front of her. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his jaw worked as if he were gathering courage. His eyes were blue, she noticed, a clear, striking blue that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. Miss Morton. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by disuse or perhaps by years of keeping silent. Would you dance with me? The question hung in the air between them. Eliza was acutely conscious of the watching crowd, of Mrs. Henshaw's scandalized expression, of Margaret's encouraging nod from across the room. But more than that, she was conscious of the vulnerability in Caleb Vance's face, the way he held himself as if braced for rejection. She should say no. That would be the sensible thing. He was an ex-convict, a man with a violent past, someone decent women didn't associate with. Saying yes would invite gossip, judgment, complications she didn't need. But Eliza Morton had spent 12 years being sensible. She'd spent 12 years putting everyone else first, building a life that was safe and respectable and profoundly lonely. And standing there, looking into the eyes of a man who knew what it meant to be on the outside looking in, she found herself making a choice that had nothing to do with sense. Yes, she said. I'd like that. The relief that washed across Caleb's face was so profound it almost hurt to witness. He offered his arm, a formal, old-fashioned gesture that revealed more about his character than any words could have. Eliza placed her hand on his sleeve, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric, and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. The band was playing a waltz, slower and more intimate than the reels that had preceded it. Caleb's hand settled at her waist with careful respect, and she placed her hand on his shoulder. Through the worn leather of his glove, she could feel the warmth of his palm as it enclosed her other hand. They began to move, and Eliza realized with some surprise that Caleb Vance knew how to dance. He wasn't polished. There was a roughness to his movements, a slight hesitation, but he knew the basic steps, knew how to lead without forcing. She followed, and slowly they found a rhythm together. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "for saying yes." "Thank you for asking," she replied, and meant it. They danced in silence for a few moments, navigating around other couples who gave them a wide berth. Eliza was aware of the stares, the whispers, but somehow, locked in this moving circle with Caleb, they seemed less important than they had moments ago. "I've seen you in town," Caleb said, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if eye contact would be too much. "You're kind to people. I watched you help Mrs. Patterson with her groceries last month. You didn't make a fuss about it, didn't expect thanks. You just did it." Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hadn't known anyone was watching. "Mrs. Patterson is 83 and lives alone. It's just basic decency. Not everyone has it." His eyes finally met hers, and the intensity there made her chest tighten. "Basic decency, I mean. Most folks in this town look at me and see a criminal. You look at people and see them as they are." "I don't know you well enough to see you as you are," Eliza said carefully. "No," Caleb agreed. "But you said yes when I asked you to dance. That says something about you." The song ended too soon. They stood there on the dance floor, neither quite ready to break apart, until the band launched into another tune, and other couples jostled around them. Caleb stepped back, releasing her, and Eliza felt the loss of his touch like a physical thing. "Thank you, Miss Morton," he said formally, starting to turn away. Eliza surprised herself. "Mr. Vance, there's punch if you'd like some." "It's quite good this year." The hope that flickered across his face was almost painful to see. "I'd like that very much." They made their way to the refreshment table, and Eliza poured 2 cups of the spiced apple punch that Mrs. Henderson made every year. They found a small table in the corner, away from the main flow of traffic, and sat down. The music continued, the dancing went on, but Eliza and Caleb existed in their own small bubble of conversation. At first they talked about simple things. The weather, cold coming early this year. The harvest, decent yields despite the dry summer. The mountains, beautiful in every season, but autumn was special. But gradually, as they relaxed into each other's presence, the conversation deepened. Caleb told her about his ranch, the work he was doing to build the herd, his plans for the property. There was pride in his voice when he spoke of fixing the barn roof himself, of clearing new pasture land, of slowly turning the struggling ranch into something viable. Eliza listened, hearing beneath the words, a man determined to prove himself, to build something honest with his own hands. In turn, she told him about her shop, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from raw fabric, about the challenge of running a business in a town where everyone knew your story. She told him about Thomas, about raising her brother and sending him off to college. She kept her voice light, but Caleb seemed to hear the cost of those years, the dreams deferred and the loneliness accumulated. You gave up a lot for him, Caleb observed. I'd do it again, Eliza said firmly. Family matters. Yes, Caleb said quietly. It does. There was a story there, Eliza sensed, some pain around the word family that he wasn't ready to share. She didn't push. They'd only just met, after all. There would be time. An hour passed, like minutes. They talked until the punch bowl was empty and the band began their final set. Finally, reluctantly, Caleb stood. May I walk you home, Miss Morton? I'd appreciate that, Eliza said. They retrieved their things from the cloakroom and stepped out into the October night. The temperature had dropped, and their breath formed small clouds in the air. Above them, stars scattered across the sky in impossible numbers, the way they only did in places far from city lights. They walked slowly, neither in a hurry to end the evening. The music from the town hall faded behind them, replaced by the sound of their footsteps and the distant bark of a dog. Eliza pointed out constellations, and Caleb told her about seeing the northern lights from his ranch last winter. Too soon they reached her shop. The windows were dark, the street empty. Caleb stood on the wooden sidewalk, his hat in his hands once again, and Eliza found herself not wanting the night to end. Miss Morton, Caleb began, then paused, as if searching for the right words. Eliza, if I may, I know what people think of me. I know I'm not the kind of man a respectable woman should be seen with. But tonight, he started again. Tonight was the finest evening I've had in more years than I care to count, and I'd like to see you again, if you'd allow it. May I call on you? Eliza looked at him standing there in the starlight. This man who'd served his time and was trying to build a decent life, who'd asked her to dance when no one else had, who'd made her feel seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. I'd like that, Mr. Vance, she said softly. I'd like that very much. The smile that broke across his face transformed him. For a moment, he wasn't the feared ex-convict or the struggling rancher. He was just a man who'd been given an unexpected gift. Caleb, he said. Please call me Caleb. Then you should call me Eliza. Eliza. He said her name like it was something precious. Good night, then. And thank you. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that managed to be both formal and intimate, and walked away into the darkness. Eliza stood on her doorstep, watching until he disappeared around the corner. Then she let herself inside, closing the door behind her and leaning against it. Her heart was racing. Her hands were trembling. Everything had changed. That night, Eliza lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She replayed every moment of the evening. The shock of Caleb crossing the floor toward her, the feeling of his hand at her waist, the timbre of his voice saying her name. She thought about the year ahead, about the possibility of someone to share it with, about the risk she was taking. The risk. Because there would be consequences to this, she knew. The town would talk. Some of her customers might take their business elsewhere. She might lose friendships, face judgment, become the subject of gossip and speculation, but lying there in the darkness, remembering how it felt to be seen, to be chosen, to dance with someone who understood loneliness as intimately as she did. Eliza found she didn't care about the consequences. For the first time in 12 years, she was choosing something for herself. And whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes open and her heart finally, terrifyingly willing to take a chance. 3 days passed before Caleb appeared at her shop. 3 days during which Eliza tried to focus on her work while her mind wandered to Saturday night, to the feeling of being held while dancing, to the sound of her name in Caleb's rough voice. 3 days during which Cedar Ridge buzzed with speculation about what everyone was already calling the situation. Margaret had stopped by Monday afternoon with a full report. "Mrs. Henshaw says it's unseemly," she'd announced, settling into the chair by Eliza's work table. "She told half the congregation after Sunday service that you were making a spectacle of yourself. On the other hand, Mrs. Henderson thinks it's romantic. She actually used that word, romantic. Old Samuel Hutchins said anyone who paid their debt to society deserves a second chance. But then Deputy Brennan muttered something about leopards and spots." Eliza had kept her eyes on her stitching, her needle moving through the fabric with practiced precision. "And what do you think, Margaret?" "I think you smiled more on Saturday night than you have in the past 5 years," Margaret had replied firmly. "And I think that counts for something." But as Monday became Tuesday, and Tuesday became Wednesday with no word from Caleb, doubt crept in. Perhaps he'd reconsidered. Perhaps the reality of courting the town seamstress, with all the visibility that entailed, was more than he wanted to deal with. Perhaps Saturday had been an impulse he now regretted. Then just before closing on Wednesday, the bell above the shop door chimed. Eliza looked up from the ledger she'd been reconciling, and there he was. Caleb stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking as uncertain as she felt. He'd cleaned up, his shirt was pressed, his hair combed back, but there was something endearingly nervous about his posture. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all." Eliza set down her pen, acutely aware of her ink-stained fingers and the wayward strand of hair that had escaped her bun. "Please, come in." He stepped inside, seeming too large for the small space, and reached into his coat pocket. "I brought you something." "It's not much." He held out his hand, and in his palm lay a single pressed wildflower. It was delicate, with 5 pale petals the color of early morning sky, preserved between 2 thin pieces of paper. "It's an alpine forget-me-not," Caleb said, his voice soft. "I found it up on the ridge above my ranch. They only grow in high places, where the air is thin and the wind is hard. But they're survivors, beautiful and strong at the same time." He paused, met her eyes. "It reminded me of you." Eliza took the flower carefully, feeling the fragile weight of it in her hand. No one had ever brought her flowers before. The gesture, so simple and so thoughtful, touched something deep inside her. "It's lovely," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Thank you." "I wanted to come sooner," Caleb continued, the words coming faster now, as if he'd been holding them in. "But I wasn't sure. I didn't know if you'd want to see me again. Saturday was, well, it was perfect. But in the clear light of day, I thought you might reconsider." "I haven't reconsidered," Eliza said firmly. The relief on his face was immediate. "Then I'd like to ask, if you're not busy Sunday after church, would you come out to the ranch? I'd like to show you the place properly. I'll bring you back before dark, of course." Everything respectable. Eliza thought about the obligations of her Sunday, the usual quiet afternoon, perhaps tea with Margaret, perhaps catching up on mending. A safe, predictable routine that suddenly seemed unbearably empty. "I'd like that very much," she said. Sunday arrived bright and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Eliza attended the morning service at Cedar Ridge Community Church, aware of the eyes following her, the whispers that stopped when she drew near. She kept her head high, sang the hymns, and tried not to think about what people were saying. Caleb was waiting outside after the service, standing apart from the congregation with his hands in his pockets. He'd brought a clean wagon with a bench seat, and he helped her up with careful courtesy. As they pulled away from the church, Eliza could feel the weight of watching eyes. But Caleb simply clicked to the horses and guided them down Main Street toward the road that led to his ranch. The ride took almost an hour, the wagon following a rutted track that climbed gradually through pine forest. Caleb pointed out landmarks, a particular boulder that marked the property line, a creek where he'd seen a black bear last spring, a meadow where wildflowers grew thick in summer. He talked more easily out here, away from the town and its judgment, and Eliza found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the journey. They crossed Cedar Creek twice, the horses splashing through shallow water, and emerged into a high valley ringed by mountains. There, nestled against the tree line, was Caleb's ranch. The house was small but solid, built of squared logs with a stone chimney. The barn was larger, painted red at some point in its history, though the paint was fading now. Beyond the barn, a split-rail fence enclosed several acres of pasture where a dozen cattle grazed. It wasn't grand, but there was something honest about it. Something real. It's beautiful, Eliza said, and meant it. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, and she could see pride mixed with vulnerability in his expression. "It's mine," he said simply. "Every nail, every fence post. Mine because I worked for it." He showed her around. The barn where he kept his horses and stored his hay. The chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched and pecked. The small vegetable garden he'd planted behind the house. He talked about his plans, his voice warming with enthusiasm. He wanted to expand the herd, build a proper bunkhouse for hired help when he could afford it, maybe start breeding horses. "I want to build something that lasts," he said. "Something I can be proud of. Something that proves I'm more than what I was." They ate lunch at a rough-hewn table inside the house. Bread and cheese and apples from his small orchard, simple fare that tasted better than it had any right to. The house was spare but clean, with little decoration beyond a few books on a shelf and a photograph of a stern-faced couple that Eliza assumed were his parents. After lunch, Caleb saddled 2 horses and taught her to ride properly. Eliza had been on horses before, of course, but Caleb had a patient way of explaining things, of showing her how to sit, how to hold the reins, how to move with the animal rather than against it. They rode up to a ridge above the ranch, where the view stretched for miles in every direction, mountains and forest and sky. They sat on a flat rock, the horses grazing nearby, and watched the sun begin its descent toward the western peaks. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. "I spent 5 years in a stone box," Caleb said finally, his voice low. 5 years where I couldn't see the horizon, couldn't feel the wind, couldn't be alone with my thoughts without iron bars around me. I made mistakes, Eliza, bad ones, hurt people even if I didn't pull the trigger myself, and I paid for it. But sitting here now, with all this, he gestured at the landscape spread before them. I finally feel like maybe I've earned the right to start over. Eliza reached over and took his hand, the leather of his glove warm under her palm. Everyone deserves a second chance. Not everyone gets one, Caleb said, turning to look at her. You could have said no when I asked you to dance. Most people would have. Why didn't you? Eliza considered the question, trying to find words for something she didn't fully understand herself. Because I've spent 12 years doing what was expected of me, she said finally. Being dutiful, being responsible, being the person everyone needed me to be. And somewhere along the way, I forgot to live. When you asked me to dance, I saw a chance to choose something for myself. Something that might not make sense, that might not be safe, but that felt real. Caleb lifted her hand to his lips and kissed, her knuckles gently, a gesture that was somehow more intimate than any embrace. I'm not an easy choice. No, Eliza agreed, but maybe I don't want easy anymore. As the sun touched the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Caleb leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met. In a kiss that was tentative at first, then deeper, both of them discovering this new territory together. When they finally drew apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. May I see you again? Yes, Eliza said, her heart full of something she was afraid to name. As often as you'd like. They rode back down to the ranch as twilight settled over the valley. On the drive back to Cedar Ridge, they talked about small things. The coming winter, Thomas's studies, Caleb's hope of getting a good price for his cattle in the spring. But beneath the ordinary conversation ran something deeper, a current of possibility that both excited and frightened Eliza in equal measure. At her door, Caleb said goodnight with another gentle kiss, and Eliza watched him drive away before going inside. She placed the pressed forget-me-not on her bedside table, where she could see it first thing in the morning, and lay awake for a long time, thinking about choices and consequences and the terrifying beauty of letting someone in. 3 weeks into their courtship, Eliza found herself working on a shirt by lamplight, her needle moving through blue cotton that matched the color of Caleb's eyes. It was foolish, perhaps, to put so much care into a simple garment, but she couldn't help herself. Every stitch was an expression of something she wasn't quite ready to say aloud. They'd been seeing each other twice weekly, Wednesday evenings when Caleb came to town for supplies, and Sunday afternoons when they'd ride out to some quiet spot on his ranch. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories in layers. Eliza had learned that Caleb preferred his coffee black, that he'd taught himself to read in prison, that he could identify every bird that nested in the valley. Caleb had learned that Eliza sang while she worked, that she'd always wanted to see the ocean, that she missed her parents most in autumn when the light was golden. But the town's reaction had grown more pronounced. Where initial shock had given way to resigned acceptance for some, for others it had hardened into active disapproval. Mrs. Henshaw had stopped bringing her mending to the shop, taking it instead to the seamstress in Willow Creek, 15 miles south. 2 other regular customers had followed suit, offering thin excuses that fooled no one. Margaret remained stalwart. "Narrow-minded old biddies," she'd declared when Eliza had mentioned the lost business. "You're better off without their custom." But Eliza noticed things, the way conversations stopped when she entered the general store, the pointed glances exchanged at church, the carefully neutral expressions of people who'd once greeted her warmly. Cedar Ridge was a small town, and choosing Caleb Vance meant choosing to be outside the circle of easy acceptance. Still, when she looked at the shirt taking shape under her hands, she couldn't regret her choice. The fabric was good quality, purchased from the traveling merchant who came through twice a year. She'd cut the pattern to fit Caleb's broad shoulders, had reinforced the seams for durability, had added small details, French cuffs, a subtle pattern in the stitching that elevated it beyond ordinary workwear. It was the first garment she'd sewn for someone she cared for romantically, and every stitch carried weight. On Wednesday evening, Caleb arrived at her shop just as she was closing, the last of the autumn light fading from the sky. He brought news, a good cattle sale that meant he could make improvements to the ranch, could maybe hire temporary help come spring. His face was animated in a way she'd rarely seen, his usual guardedness momentarily forgotten in his excitement. "That's wonderful," Eliza said, genuinely pleased. "You've worked so hard." 3 years, Caleb said. 3 years of wondering if I could make this work. And it's finally starting to feel real, like maybe I really can build something here. I never doubted it, Eliza said, and realized it was true. She'd seen his determination, his willingness to work dawn to dusk, his careful stewardship of every resource. She handed him the wrapped package, suddenly nervous. "I made you something." Caleb unwrapped the brown paper carefully, revealing the folded shirt. He held it up, examining the fabric, the stitching, the careful details. His expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, wonder, and something that looked like pain. "Eliza, this is—" His voice caught. He had to stop, clear his throat, try again. "No one's made me anything since my mother died, not in 15 years. "Try it on," she said softly. He shrugged out of his worn workshirt and pulled on the new one. It fit perfectly, as she'd known it would. The blue brought out his eyes, and the cut made his shoulders look broader, more commanding. He looked like a man of substance, not an ex-convict struggling to survive. Caleb examined himself in the small mirror by her work table, touching the fabric with something like reverence. When he turned back to her, his eyes were bright. "It's perfect," he said simply. "You're—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. "You're the finest thing that's ever happened to me, Eliza Morton." She stepped forward, straightening his collar, though it didn't need straightening, just wanting an excuse to be close to him. "You're worth the effort." He pulled her into an embrace, and they stood there in the dimming shop, holding each other as the world darkened outside. When he finally released her, they sat on her small porch, the autumn evening settling around them. "Tell me something true," Caleb said, a question he'd asked before, one that had become their way of going deeper. Eliza thought about it. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, never of you, but of what this means, of how my life is changing. I built something here, something safe and predictable, and now it's not safe anymore," Caleb finished. "No, but maybe that's not a bad thing. What do you want, Eliza?" His voice was serious, intent. "Really want, if you could have anything?" She'd been asked versions of this question before, by Margaret, by Thomas in his letters, by herself in the quiet hours of the night. But she'd never answered honestly, not even to herself. Safety had always seemed like the only reasonable goal. "I want a partnership," she said finally. "Not someone to take care of me, or someone I need to take care of. I want an equal, someone to build something with, not someone to rescue me or someone who needs rescuing. I want to matter to someone, and to have them matter to me. I want—" She paused, gathering courage. "I want to stop being alone." Caleb took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I want those things too. I've spent 3 years working myself, half to death, building the ranch, trying to prove I'm more than my worst choices. But building something by yourself it's hollow. I want someone to share it with, someone to sit with on the porch when the work is done, someone to make plans with." He met her eyes. "I want you, Eliza, not just for now, but for keeps. And I promise you this, I will never make you into someone's caretaker again. You'll be my partner in every way that matters." The kiss that followed was different from the ones before, deeper, more certain, carrying the weight of commitment. When they finally drew apart, Eliza rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him through the shirt she'd made. He left an hour later, reluctant to go but conscious of propriety. Eliza watched from her porch as he drove away, then turned to go inside. Something white caught her eye, a piece of paper tucked under her door. She pulled it out, unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, deliberately disguised, she thought. The message was brief and brutal. "He's not worth your reputation. Everyone's talking. Think about what you're doing before it's too late." Eliza stood there on her porch, the note trembling in her hand. She thought about the customers she'd lost, the whispers that followed her, the way some people looked at her now with disappointment or disapproval. She thought about the life she'd built, safe and respectable, and how much of it she might lose by continuing down this path. Then she thought about Caleb's face when he'd put on the shirt she'd made him. She thought about his promise of partnership, of building something together. She thought about the way her heart felt larger, fuller, more alive than it had in years. Eliza folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket. Tomorrow she'd throw it away. Tonight she'd acknowledge its truth. She was choosing a hard path, one that would cost her something. But standing there under the stars, she found she was willing to pay the price. Some things, she was learning, were worth the risk. Some chances only came once, and if she let fear dictate her choices now, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. Inside her small room, Eliza prepared for bed, her mind quiet despite the day's events. She'd made her choice. Now she'd live with the consequences, whatever they might be. And somehow, knowing that Caleb was out there on his ranch, perhaps wearing the shirt she'd made him, perhaps thinking of her as she thought of him, made those consequences seem manageable. She fell asleep, with the pressed forget-me-not on her bedside table and a man's promise of partnership still warm in her heart. The first snow fell on Cedar Ridge in early November, soft flakes that drifted down from a pewter sky and settled on the wooden sidewalks like scattered lace. Eliza watched from her shop window as the world turned white, a beautiful transformation that would have delighted her in other years. But this year, the snow brought worry along with its beauty. Her order book was thin, where once it had been full of entries. A dress for the Henderson girl, alterations for Mrs. Patterson, new curtains for the Wilsons. Now there were gaps, empty spaces that represented lost income. Some customers remained loyal, but others had quietly taken their business elsewhere, to the seamstress in Willow Creek, or to their own needle and thread. No one said anything directly. That wasn't how things worked in small towns. Instead, there were apologetic smiles and vague excuses. "Oh, I've been meaning to stop by, but I've been so busy. I'm trying to economize this winter. My sister-in-law offered to help me with that." But Eliza knew the truth. She'd chosen Caleb Vance, and Cedar Ridge was making her pay for it. Margaret stopped by on a Thursday afternoon, stamping snow from her boots and bringing with her a blast of cold air. "The church ladies had their meeting yesterday," she announced, without preamble. "Mrs. Henshaw expressed concern about your situation. Said someone should speak to you about making better choices. And did anyone volunteer?" Eliza asked, her needle never pausing. Mrs. Henderson told her to mind her own business. Nearly caused a schism. Margaret settled into her chair, her eyes sharp with concern. "How bad is it, really?" "The business, I mean." Eliza set down her work and looked at her friend. "I'm down by half, maybe more. If it continues like this through winter, I'll struggle to make rent come spring. You could apply for credit at the bank." "The Henshaws own the bank," Eliza reminded her. "I somehow doubt they'd be sympathetic to my application." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Is it worth it?" "I'm not judging, mind you. I'm just asking." Eliza thought about Caleb, about the way he looked at her as if she were something precious, about the conversations that stretched for hours, about the feeling of building something real with someone who understood her. "Yes," she said simply. "It's worth it." That evening, Caleb arrived at her shop carrying a package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a rabbit he'd trapped, already cleaned and ready for cooking. "For your dinner," he said. "Thought you might appreciate some fresh meat." It was a practical gift, the kind of thing a rancher would think of, and Eliza was touched by the consideration. But when she thanked him, she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was tight. "What's wrong?" she asked. Caleb hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. It was a pocket watch, old and tarnished, the glass face cracked. He opened it carefully, showing her that the hands were stopped at 3:47. "This was my father's," he said quietly. "He died when I was 23. Ranch accident, a spooked horse, a bad fall. By the time I got to him, he was already gone. This watch stopped at the moment of his death." Eliza took the watch carefully, feeling the weight of grief and guilt attached to it. "I'm sorry. He was a good man. Built a decent ranch, raised me right. Taught me to work hard, to keep my word, to treat people fairly." Caleb's voice was rough with old pain. "And I threw it all away. After he died, there were debts I didn't know about. The ranch went under. I was angry, stupid, desperate. I fell in with men who offered easy answers, and I made choices that would have broken his heart if he'd lived to see them. But you paid your debt," Eliza said gently. "You served your time. You've built a new life. Have I?" Caleb took the watch back, staring at the frozen hands. "Sometimes I think I'm still that angry kid who made all the wrong choices. Sometimes I think I'm just fooling myself, pretending I can be something different. Is that what you think when you're with me?" Eliza asked, her heart tight with sudden fear. "That you're fooling yourself?" "No." He looked up, his blue eyes fierce. "With you, I feel like maybe I really can be better. But I see what it's costing you, Eliza. I see the customers you're losing, the way people look at you now. And I wonder if I have any right to ask you to pay that price." Eliza moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "I'm not a child, Caleb. I made this choice with my eyes open. Yes, there are consequences, but there are consequences to every choice. For 12 years I chose safety and duty, and the consequence was loneliness. Now I'm choosing something different. What if I can't be what you need?" The vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her. "What if I'm too damaged, too—" "Stop," Eliza said firmly. "You're not damaged. You're human. You made mistakes and you paid for them. That broken watch," she gestured to it. "It's a reminder, yes. But maybe it doesn't have to be a chain. Maybe it's time to let it work again." Caleb closed the watch, his thumb rubbing over the worn surface. "My father used to say that time doesn't heal anything by itself. It's what you do with the time that matters." He sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Caleb slipped the watch back into his pocket. I wish you could have met him. He would have liked you. Later that week, an incident at the general store brought everything into sharper focus. Eliza was purchasing thread when Deputy Tom Brennan entered, his badge gleaming on his chest. He was a few years younger than Caleb, a man who'd never quite outgrown the need to prove himself. "Miss Morton," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Deputy Brennan," she replied neutrally. "Haven't seen you at the church socials lately," he observed, his voice carrying through the store. "Folks have been asking about you. I've been busy with work, of course." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Though I hear business has been slow. Unfortunate that, when a woman makes certain choices, there can be consequences." Eliza felt heat rise to her face, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, Deputy?" Caleb stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space. Brennan's expression shifted to something harder. "No problem, Vance, just making conversation." Seemed like more than conversation to me. Caleb moved to stand beside Eliza, not touching her but close enough that his support was unmistakable. The two men stared at each other, years of mutual distrust crackling between them. Brennan had been one of the deputies present when Caleb was arrested, had taken particular pleasure in seeing the outlaw brought low. Now here was that same outlaw, standing beside a respectable woman, claiming a place in a community that Brennan believed he had no right to inhabit. "You watch yourself, Vance," Brennan said finally. "One wrong step." "I know the terms of my release," Caleb said evenly. "I've kept every one of them, and I intend to keep doing so. Now, if you'll excuse us, the lady and I have business to attend to." He offered Eliza his arm, and she took it, her chin high as they walked out of the store together. Behind them, she could hear the whispers starting, but she focused on the solid warmth of Caleb beside her, on the way he'd stood up for her without hesitation. On the wooden sidewalk, she stopped him. "Thank you. You don't need to thank me for that." His voice was tight. "But Eliza, this is what I'm talking about. This is what your life is going to be like if you stay with me. People making judgments, deputies watching for any excuse, customers taking their business elsewhere. Is it really worth it?" She looked at him. This man who carried so much weight, who questioned his own worth despite all evidence to the contrary, who was trying to give her an out, even though it would cost him everything. "Yes," she said firmly, "it's worth it." "And Caleb," she waited until he met her eyes. "Maybe it's time you believed that too." They walked together through the snow-dusted streets, and as they did, Eliza noticed something. Not everyone looked away. Old Samuel Hutchins nodded to them from his porch. Mrs. Henderson waved from her front window. Young Jacob Thompson touched his hat as they passed. The town was divided, yes, but it wasn't unanimous in its condemnation. There were people who saw beyond Caleb's past, who were willing to give him a chance, who understood that everyone deserved the possibility of redemption. It would have to be enough. For now, it would have to be enough. The letter from Thomas arrived on a Tuesday, thick with pages and carrying the faint smell of pipe smoke from the college mailroom. Eliza settled into her chair by the stove, grateful for its warmth as the November cold pressed against the windows, and unfolded the familiar handwriting. Her brother wrote about his engineering studies, about a professor who was brilliant but scattered, about a bridge design that had captivated his imagination. But buried in the middle of the third page was the passage that made Eliza's heart catch. "Your last letter mentioned someone named Caleb. You didn't say much, but I could read between the lines. You're happier than you've been in years. I'd like to meet him when I come home for Christmas. Anyone who can make my sister sound like she's finally living her own life, instead of just existing for everyone else's sake, deserves my respect. I'm proud of you, Eliza. You gave me everything. Now it's your turn." Eliza read the words 3 times, each time feeling the weight of her brother's approval settle over her like a blanket. Thomas understood. The one person whose opinion mattered most, the one she'd raised from boyhood, understood what she was doing and why. But the letter also brought into sharp focus a truth she'd been avoiding. Her financial situation was becoming critical. She'd already dipped into her savings to make last month's rent, If the winter continued like this, with customers staying away and orders drying up, she'd be facing hard choices come spring. The shop wasn't just her livelihood, it was her independence, her identity, the thing she'd built with her own hands when she had nothing. The thought of losing it, of having to close the doors and admit defeat, made her stomach twist with anxiety. She was still holding Thomas's letter when Caleb arrived that evening, shaking snow from his coat. One look at her face, and his expression shifted to concern. "What's wrong?" She showed him the letter, watching as he read it carefully. When he finished, he looked up with a small smile. "He sounds like a good man. I'm glad he approves. He wants to meet you at Christmas." "I'd like that." Caleb set the letter down gently. "But that's not what has you looking worried." "Tell me." Eliza hesitated, then told him everything, the exact state of her finances, the calculations she'd been doing, the very real possibility that she might not be able to keep the shop open through another slow season. The words came faster as she spoke, months of worry finally finding voice. Caleb listened without interrupting, his face growing serious. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Let me help." "No, Eliza, I have money from the cattle sale." "I can easily—" "No," she said again, more firmly. "I appreciate the offer, but no. Why not?" There was frustration in his voice now. "We're building something together, aren't we? Partners, you said. Partners help each other. This is different. How is it different?" Caleb stood, his size suddenly more apparent in the small space. "You're struggling. I have resources. It's the logical solution." "The logical solution," Eliza said, standing to face him, "is for me to find a way forward on my own. I won't become someone you have to rescue. That's not what this is, isn't it?" She heard her voice rising and tried to control it. "I've spent 12 years taking care of my brother, being the responsible one, the caretaker. I finally have something that's mine, built by my own effort, and I won't let it become something you gave me. I need to stand on my own, even if it means failing." Caleb's voice had an edge she'd never heard before. "Even if your pride cost you everything you've worked for?" "Yes," Eliza said, her own stubbornness rising to meet his. "Even then. Because if I let you save me now, what happens next time? And the time after that? How do I know I'm your partner and not your dependent? You think I'd hold it over you?" Caleb's expression was wounded. "You think I'm that kind of man?" "No," Eliza said, softening slightly. "But I need to know I can survive on my own. I need to prove it to myself, if no one else." They stared at each other, two strong-willed people discovering the sharp edges where their independence clashed. Finally, Caleb grabbed his coat. "I should go," he said, his voice tight. "Before I say something I'll regret." Caleb, but he was already out the door, the cold wind rushing in to fill the space where he'd been. Eliza stood alone in her shop, her heart pounding, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake. The next few days passed in painful silence. Caleb didn't come to town on Wednesday. Eliza worked in her shop, her needle moving mechanically through fabric while her mind replayed their argument. Had she been too stubborn? Too proud? But even asking herself those questions, she couldn't imagine accepting his money. It would change the fundamental nature of their relationship, would make her beholden to him in a way that would corrode what they were building. Margaret stopped by on Friday, took one look at Eliza's face and said, "You two had a fight. How did you know?" "Because you look miserable, and Caleb Vance rode through town yesterday like a thundercloud." "What happened?" Eliza told her, and Margaret listened with the careful attention of a woman who'd navigated her own share of difficult decisions. "You're both right," Margaret said finally. "And you're both wrong. He's right that partners should help each other. You're right that you need to maintain your independence. But maybe there's a middle ground you're both too stubborn to see, such as him helping you find customers instead of just giving you money. Such as you accepting practical support, like that rabbit he brought you, without seeing it as charity. Such as both of you learning that accepting help isn't the same as being helpless." Eliza sat with that, recognizing the truth in it. She'd been so focused on maintaining her independence that she'd failed to see the difference between support and rescue. Saturday morning, she made a decision. She put out word through her remaining customers that she was offering special winter rates, 20% off all work through February. It was a risk. She'd make less per piece. But if it brought customers back, it might be enough to survive until spring. By afternoon, she had 3 new orders. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to feel like a beginning. Margaret brought her needlework business and encouraged others to do the same. Mrs. Henderson stopped by with an order for new curtains, her face kind despite the gossip she'd surely heard. "My mother always said," Mrs. Henderson told her, "that the measure of a person isn't in avoiding mistakes, but in how they face consequences. You're facing yours with your head up, Eliza. That counts for something." Sunday came, and Eliza woke with her heart in her throat, wondering if Caleb would appear for their usual time together. She attended church, sat through the service, barely hearing the sermon, and walked home alone through the cold afternoon. She was measuring fabric for one of her new orders when the bell above her door chimed. Caleb stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking as uncertain as she felt. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "About what you said. About standing on your own. Caleb, he held up a hand. "Let me finish. You're right. You need to prove to yourself that you can handle this. I understand that. I've spent 3 years doing the same thing with my ranch. But Eliza," he stepped closer, "partners aren't just about financial support. They're about being there. About not letting someone face things alone, even if you can't fix them. I can't give you money, I understand that now. But can I just be here? Can I sit with you while you work, bring you dinner when you're too busy to cook, listen when you need to talk? Can you accept that much?" Eliza felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. "Yes," she said. "I can accept that." They came together in the middle of her shop, holding each other tight. The argument had cost them something, that first bright sheen of perfect harmony, but what they'd found in its place felt more real, more durable. "I'm sorry," Eliza said against his shoulder. "I was so focused on not being dependent that I forgot the difference between support and rescue, and I was so focused on helping that I forgot why you need to do this yourself." Caleb pulled back to look at her. "We're both stubborn people." "Yes," Eliza agreed. "We are. Think we can make this work anyway?" "I think we have to try." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, not fixing anything, not solving her financial problems, just being together. Caleb sat in the chair by her work table while she worked, occasionally reading aloud from the book he'd brought, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. It was ordinary and profound at the same time, this quiet sharing of space and time. When he left that evening, Eliza felt more settled than she had in days. The future was still uncertain. Her business was still struggling. The town was still divided in its opinion of their relationship. But they'd weathered their first real conflict and come out the other side not weaker, but stronger. The stranger rode into Cedar Ridge on a cold December morning, his horse tired and his coat dusty from hard travel. He was a man in his 50s, with gray streaking his dark hair, a marshal's badge pinned to his vest, and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and asked Deputy Brennan a single question: "Where can I find Caleb Vance?" Word spread through town faster than wildfire. A marshal looking for Caleb Vance could only mean one thing: trouble. Old fears resurfaced quickly in small communities, and by noon, half of Cedar Ridge was convinced that Caleb had broken the terms of his release, that he'd committed some new crime, that everything decent people had feared about him was coming true. Eliza heard about it from Margaret, who rushed to the shop during her lunch break. "There's a territorial marshal asking about Caleb," she said breathlessly. "Deputy Brennan is taking him out to the ranch right now." Eliza's hands stilled on the fabric she'd been cutting. Fear lanced through her, cold and sharp. "What does he want?" "No one knows. But Eliza," Margaret's face was grave, "it doesn't look good." Eliza set down her scissors with hands that weren't quite steady. She thought about Caleb, about everything they'd built together, about the fragile hope they'd been nurturing, and she thought about how quickly it could all come apart. "I'm closing the shop," she said, already reaching for her coat. Eliza, you can't. He stood by me when this whole town was whispering about me. I'm not going to abandon him now. She borrowed a horse from the livery. Sam Peterson, the owner, handed over the reins without question and rode out to Caleb's ranch faster than was probably wise. The cold wind bit at her face, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was Caleb, about what this might mean, about the life they'd been building that might be crumbling even as she rode. When she arrived, she saw 3 horses tied outside Caleb's house, his own, the marshal's, and Deputy Brennan's. She dismounted quickly and approached the door, but before she could knock, it opened. Caleb stood there, his face unreadable. Behind him, she could see the marshal seated at the rough table and Deputy Brennan standing in the corner with barely concealed satisfaction. "Eliza," Caleb said, surprise and something else. Was it fear crossing his features? "You shouldn't be here." "Yes, I should." She stepped inside, ignoring Brennan's disapproving expression, and looked directly at the marshal. "I'm Eliza Morton. Whatever this is about, I think I have a right to know." The marshal studied her for a long moment, then gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down, Miss Morton. I'm Marshal James Garrett. I've come from Helena with some news that concerns Mr. Vance." Eliza sat, her heart pounding. Caleb remained standing, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Marshal Garrett pulled out a worn folder and opened it. "Mr. Vance, you were convicted of armed robbery 8 years ago. You served 5 years in Deer Lodge for your part in a series of hold-ups committed by the Dalton gang. During one of those robberies, a territorial marshal named Robert Thorne was shot and seriously wounded." "I know what I did," Caleb said, his voice low. "I paid for it." "Yes, you did." The marshal looked up. "What you might not know is that Robert Thorne has been investigating the Dalton gang for the past 3 years. The other members continued their criminal activities after you were arrested. They've become more violent, more dangerous. 2 months ago, they killed a bank clerk in Billings." Eliza felt cold seep into her bones. "What does this have to do with Caleb?" "Marshal Thorne believes that Caleb Vance might have information that could help us locate the remaining gang members," Garrett said. "He asked me to make the journey here personally because of the unusual nature of this request." "Unusual how?" Caleb's voice was wary. Marshal Garrett leaned back in his chair. "When you turned yourself in 8 years ago, you gave testimony that helped convict 2 other gang members. You didn't have to do that. You could have kept silent, served your time, protected your former associates. But you cooperated fully with the investigation." Marshal Thorne remembered that. "I was trying to do the right thing," Caleb said. "For once in my life. Last year, Marshal Thorne tracked down some of your old testimony. He read through it again, looking for details that might help with the current investigation. And he found something, references to a hideout, a place where the gang would meet between jobs. You mentioned it in passing, said it was somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, but you didn't know the exact location." Caleb nodded slowly. "I only went there once and it was dark. I couldn't have found it again if I tried." "Marshal Thorne thinks you might remember more than you realize," Garrett said. "He's asked me to request your help. If you could work with our mapmakers, try to recreate the route. Any landmarks you remember, it might give us the lead we need to finally bring these men to justice." Deputy Brennan spoke up from the corner, his voice sharp. "Why should we believe he'll help?" "He's one of them." "Was," Caleb corrected, his voice hard. "I was one of them. I served my time." "I'm not that person anymore." Marshal Garrett ignored Brennan and focused on Caleb. "I'll be honest with you, Vance. Marshal Thorne was reluctant to reach out. He wasn't sure if you'd want to help given your history. But he also said something else. He said that in 30 years of law enforcement, he's learned that people aren't defined by their worst moments. They're defined by what they do after those moments. You turned yourself in. You cooperated. You've kept clean for 3 years since your release. That suggests you might be willing to help now." The room was silent, except for the ticking of Caleb's father's pocket watch, the one that no longer stopped at 3:47. He'd had it repaired last week. A quiet step forward that Eliza had witnessed with pride. "What happens if I help?" Caleb asked finally. "Nothing changes regarding your situation," Garrett said. Your debt to society is paid. This would be purely voluntary. But if your information helps us apprehend these men before they hurt anyone else, it would be noted in your file. It might make a difference if you ever needed to relocate. Or, he glanced at Eliza, if you ever wanted to put your past completely behind you. Caleb looked at Eliza then, really looked at her, and she saw the question in his eyes. This was a chance to do something right, to help prevent future violence, to prove once and for all that he'd left his past behind. But it also meant dredging up memories he'd spent years trying to forget, cooperating with the law enforcement officers who'd once put him in chains, exposing himself to scrutiny and judgment all over again. Eliza stood and crossed to him. She took his hand, the one that no longer wore the glove constantly, another small victory, and squeezed it gently. "I'll support whatever you decide," she said quietly. "But Caleb, this could be a chance to close that chapter for good. To prove to yourself and to everyone else exactly who you are now." Caleb's jaw worked as he wrestled with the decision. Finally, he turned to Marshal Garrett. "I'll help. I'll tell you everything I remember. Work with your map makers, whatever you need. But I have one condition." "What's that?" "This stays between us. I don't want the whole town knowing why you're here. Don't want to stir up old fears and old gossip. Can you do that?" Marshal Garrett nodded. "We can be discreet." "Then I'm in." Deputy Brennan looked disappointed, as if he'd been hoping for a different outcome, for proof that Caleb was still the criminal he wanted him to be. But Marshal Garrett stood and extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb shook it. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. I'll arrange for you to come to Helena next week. We'll put you up in a hotel, cover your expenses. It shouldn't take more than a few days." After the lawman left, Eliza and Caleb stood in his small house, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Caleb moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered mountains. "I thought I'd left all that behind," he said quietly. "Thought I could just build my ranch, live my life, and never have to think about those years again." Eliza joined him at the window. "Sometimes the past comes back, but this time it's giving you a chance to make things right. What if I can't remember enough? What if my information leads nowhere? Then at least you tried. At least you stood up and chose the right side." She turned him to face her. "Do you realize what just happened? A marshal came looking for you, and instead of finding an ex-convict trying to hide, he found a man willing to help bring criminals to justice. That says everything about who you've become." Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I couldn't have done this without you. A year ago, if a marshal had shown up, I would have been defensive, hostile. But you've shown me that I don't have to be defined by my past, that I can be more." They stood there as the winter afternoon faded into evening, two people who'd found each other against all odds, facing together what they couldn't have faced alone. And for the first time since the stranger rode into town, Eliza felt hope instead of fear. This wasn't the end of Caleb's past haunting him. It was the beginning of him finally, truly, leaving it behind. Caleb left for Helena on a Monday morning, riding out before dawn with Marshal Garrett. Eliza stood on her porch watching them go, the cold December air biting at her face, her heart tight with worry despite Caleb's reassurances. He'd promised to be back within a week, in plenty of time for Thomas's arrival. But the uncertainty of what he was riding toward weighed on her. The town, despite Marshal Garrett's promise of discretion, had noticed. People talked, speculated, worried. Some saw it as proof that Caleb hadn't truly reformed. Others wondered if he was in some kind of trouble. A very few, understood that whatever was happening, it was complicated. Deputy Brennan made sure his version of events circulated. "The law's taking Caleb Vance to Helena," he told anyone who would listen. "Make of that what you will." Eliza found herself defending Caleb more than she'd expected, correcting misconceptions, standing firm against implications and insinuations. It was exhausting, but she refused to let the town's gossip go unchallenged. Margaret stood with her, as did Mrs. Henderson, and a handful of others who'd seen past Caleb's history to the man he'd become. On Wednesday, Eliza received a telegram at the general store. The clerk handed it over with barely concealed curiosity, and she opened it with trembling hands, working with territorial investigators. Good progress, miss you. Home by Saturday. See 6 days. She could manage 6 days. Eliza folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her pocket, ignoring the clerk's obvious interest in its contents. Her shop had seen a modest upturn in business. The winter rates had brought some customers back, and word was spreading that her work was worth the trip, even if it meant associating with that woman who's courting the ex-convict. It wasn't prosperity, but it was survival, and that was enough for now. On Thursday evening, as Eliza was closing the shop, Mrs. Henshaw appeared at her door. The banker's wife stood on the threshold, her expression carefully neutral, her elaborate hat slightly askew from the wind. "Miss Morton, may I have a word?" Eliza's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity won out. She stepped back, allowing Mrs. Henshaw to enter. The older woman looked around the shop as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the bolts of fabric, the carefully organized thread, the evidence of skilled work everywhere. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Henshaw said abruptly. "I've been unfair to you. And to Mr. Vance, I let old prejudices cloud my judgment." Eliza waited, saying nothing, giving the woman space to continue. "My husband told me what really happened," Mrs. Henshaw went on. "About the marshal's visit, about why Mr. Vance went to Helena. He's helping the authorities track down dangerous criminals. That takes courage, especially for a man trying to leave his past behind." "Yes," Eliza said carefully. "It does. I've spent 2 months turning people against you, spreading doubt about your choices. I was wrong to do that." Mrs. Henshaw's voice was stiff, the words clearly difficult. "My nephew was hurt in a robbery 5 years ago, and I've held that anger against anyone who's ever broken the law. But that's not fair, and it's not right. People can change." "I should have remembered that. Thank you for saying so," Eliza said quietly. "I'd like to place an order." Mrs. Henshaw reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I need a new dress for the Christmas social." "I'd appreciate it if you'd make it for me." Eliza took the paper, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. "I'd be honored." After Mrs. Henshaw left, Eliza sat at her work table for a long time, feeling something shift in the weight she'd been carrying. Not everyone would come around. She understood that. But if Mrs. Henshaw, the most vocal critic of her relationship with Caleb, could reconsider her position, perhaps others might follow. Friday brought another telegram. "Provided key information. Investigators optimistic. Can't wait to see you." See, Eliza read it 3 times, relief washing through her. He was coming home. He was safe, and he'd done what the authorities needed. Had proven once again that his past didn't define his present. Saturday morning, she deep-cleaned her small living quarters above the shop, preparing for Thomas's arrival the following week. Her brother would need a place to stay, and she wanted everything perfect. She washed linens, scrubbed floors, polished the few pieces of decent furniture she owned. It was practical work, but it also gave her something to do with her anxious energy while waiting for Caleb's return. He arrived late Saturday afternoon, riding into town looking exhausted but whole. Eliza had been watching from her shop window, and when she saw him, she abandoned all pretense of propriety and ran out to meet him. He dismounted and caught her in his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "I'm back," he said into her hair. "It's done." They went inside, away from curious eyes, and Caleb told her everything. He'd spent 3 days working with territorial map-makers and investigators, recreating routes from memory, describing landmarks, piecing together fragments of information from 8 years ago. The investigators thought they'd identified the hideout's location and were planning a raid for early January. "Marshal Thorne came to see me," Caleb said, sitting at a small table and accepting the coffee she'd made. "The man I shot. I hadn't seen him since the trial. What did he say?" Eliza asked, her heart in her throat. "He thanked me. Said the information I'd provided might save lives. Then he said," Caleb's voice roughened, "he said that he'd hated me for years. Hated what I'd done to him, the pain I'd caused his family. But watching me work with his colleagues, seeing how hard I was trying to help, he realized I wasn't the same man who'd pulled that trigger. He said he forgave me. Tears stung Eliza's eyes. Oh, Caleb, I never thought I'd hear those words from him. Never thought I deserved to. Caleb looked at her, his blue eyes bright. I've spent 3 years trying to prove I'm different, trying to earn redemption. But it wasn't until he said those words that I really believed it might be possible. They sat together in the quiet of her shop, drinking coffee and talking until the winter dark settled around them. Caleb told her about Helena, about the strange experience of working alongside lawmen who'd once been his captors, about the moment when a map finally clicked into place and he'd been able to pinpoint exactly where the hideout was. I felt useful, he said. Not like an ex-convict trying to hide from his past, but like someone who could help, who had something valuable to contribute. It changed something in me. I can see it, Eliza said, studying his face. You're standing taller, because I'm not carrying as much weight. He reached across the table and took her hand. Thank you for believing in me. For standing by me when most of the town wanted you to walk away. I don't know if I could have done any of this without you. You would have, Eliza said firmly. You were already on this path. I just walked it with you. Will you keep walking with me? The question was quiet, weighted with meaning. For as long as you'll have me. Sunday brought a surprise. The minister mentioned Caleb by name during his sermon, praising his willingness to help law enforcement and calling it an example of true redemption. Several congregants approached Eliza after the service, their attitudes noticeably warmer than they'd been in weeks. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was progress. The week leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of preparation. Eliza finished Mrs. Henshaw's dress, a beautiful creation in deep green velvet that would be the envy of the Christmas social. She completed several other orders that had come in, feeling the first real financial security she'd had in months. And she prepared for Thomas's arrival, cleaning and cooking, and trying not to be too nervous about her brother meeting Caleb. Caleb, meanwhile, worked his ranch with renewed energy, fixing things that had been neglected during his trip to Helena, preparing for the hardest part of winter that was still to come. But he came to town every evening, spending time with Eliza, helping her with tasks around her shop, making sure she knew he was there. On the evening before Thomas was due to arrive, they sat together on Eliza's porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Are you nervous about meeting him? Eliza asked. Terrified, Caleb admitted. He's the most important person in your life. What if he doesn't approve? He will, Eliza said confidently. Thomas has good instincts. He'll see what I see, a good man who's working hard to build a better life. What do you see? Caleb asked softly. Eliza thought about it, about how to put into words everything she felt. I see someone who's brave enough to face his mistakes, someone who keeps his promises, someone who treats people with respect even when they don't return it. I see a man who's teaching me what partnership really means. Not someone to take care of or be taken care of by, but someone to build something with, someone to grow with. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I love you, Eliza. I should have said it before now, but the words felt too big, too important. But sitting here, thinking about your brother arriving tomorrow, thinking about the future, I need you to know. I love you. Eliza felt warmth bloom in her chest, spreading through her entire body. I love you too. I think I have since that first dance, when you crossed that floor and asked me in front of everyone. When you chose me, I'll keep choosing you, Caleb said. Every day for as long as you'll let me. They kissed under the winter stars, and Eliza thought about how far they'd come from that October evening when a lonely seamstress and a scarred rancher had taken a chance on each other. They'd faced judgment, financial struggle, and the ghosts of Caleb's past. They'd argued and reconciled, had learned to support without smothering, to maintain independence while building partnership. And now, with Thomas arriving tomorrow and Christmas approaching and the future stretching out before them like fresh snow, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to possibility, but the solid hope of someone who'd done the hard work and was beginning to see it pay off. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, meeting Thomas, navigating the Christmas social, continuing to build their life together in a town that was still learning to accept them. But tonight, sitting with the man she loved under a canopy of stars, Eliza was exactly where she wanted to be. Thomas Morton stepped off the train into the cold December afternoon, a young man of 20 with his sister's auburn hair and their father's strong jaw. He wore a student's threadbare coat and carried a single battered suitcase, but his eyes were bright with intelligence and anticipation. When he spotted Eliza on the platform, his face broke into a wide smile. "Eliza!" He wrapped her in a bear hug, lifting her off her feet. "God, I've missed you. I've missed you too." Eliza held him tight, blinking back sudden tears. It'd been 6 months since his last visit, and he'd changed, filled out, grown more confident, become more fully the man he was meant to be. "Where is he?" Thomas asked when he finally released her, his eyes scanning the platform. "This Caleb you wrote about? He's coming to dinner tonight. I thought you might want to settle in first, get your bearings." Thomas grinned. "You mean you wanted to make sure I was in a good mood before introducing me to the man you're in love with?" Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I didn't say—" "You didn't have to. Your letter said it all. You're happy, Eliza, really happy. I haven't heard that in your voice since before Mom and Dad died." His expression grew serious. "I can't wait to meet the man responsible for that." They walked back to the shop through snow-dusted streets. Thomas talking about his classes, his professors, the bridge project that was consuming his final year. Eliza listened, proud and pleased, seeing the results of all those years of sacrifice and hard work. Thomas was going to graduate in the spring, had already received interest from engineering firms in Helena and Butte. He was going to be fine, more than fine. That evening, Caleb arrived at precisely 6 o'clock, his hair freshly cut, wearing the blue shirt Eliza had made him. He carried a bottle of whiskey, good stuff. She could tell from the label, and his nervousness was palpable despite his efforts to hide it. Thomas answered the door, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other. Caleb was older, broader, his presence more commanding. Thomas was younger, but carried himself with the confidence of education and opportunity. They were, in many ways, from different worlds. Then Thomas extended his hand. "Thomas Morton, you must be Caleb." Caleb shook his hand firmly. "Caleb Vance, it's good to meet you. Your sister talks about you constantly. Funny, she talks about you quite a bit too." Thomas stepped back, allowing Caleb inside. "Come in. I'm eager to hear how you two met." Over dinner, roast chicken that Eliza had labored over all afternoon, the three of them talked. At first, the conversation was careful, polite, both men testing each other's measure. But Thomas had inherited his sister's directness, and halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and looked at Caleb squarely. "My sister gave up 12 years of her life to raise me," he said quietly. She could have left, could have built a different life for herself. But she stayed, worked herself to exhaustion, made sure I had everything I needed. She's the finest person I know, and she deserves someone who understands what she's worth. "I do," Caleb said, meeting Thomas's gaze without flinching. "I understand exactly what she's worth, and I know I don't deserve her. But I'm trying every day to be worthy of the chance she's given me. Eliza tells me you've had some troubles in your past. That's putting it mildly," Caleb said. "I made terrible choices when I was younger. Hurt people. Served time for it. I can't change any of that. All I can do is try to be better now than I was then." Thomas considered this, his intelligent eyes studying Caleb's face. "What do you want with my sister?" "I want to marry her if she'll have me," Caleb said simply. "I want to build a life with her, support her dreams, be the partner she deserves. I want to spend every day showing her that choosing me wasn't a mistake." The room was quiet. Eliza's heart was pounding. Caleb had never spoken so directly about marriage before, though it had been implied in a dozen small ways. Thomas looked at his sister, saw the hope and fear warring in her expression, and then looked back at Caleb. "All right then," Thomas said. a small smile tugging at his lips. Fair enough. The tension in the room eased, and the rest of the dinner passed in genuine conversation. Caleb told stories about the ranch, about his plans for the future. Thomas shared tales from college, made them both laugh with his impressions of his professors. And Eliza sat between the two most important men in her life, feeling something settle into place that had been askew for years. After dinner, Thomas insisted on doing the dishes, while Caleb and Eliza stepped out onto the porch for a moment alone. The night was cold and clear, the kind of December evening where every sound carried and every breath formed visible clouds. "He approves," Eliza said softly. "He loves you. He wants to make sure you're taken care of. And are you?" Eliza turned to face him. "Going to take care of me?" "No," Caleb said, and at her surprised expression he smiled. "I'm going to stand beside you while you take care of yourself. I'm going to be there when you need support, step back when you need space, and never ever make you feel like you're less than the capable, independent woman you are. That's what you deserve. That's what I'm offering." "Then yes," Eliza said. "Yes. You asked if I'd marry you. In there you said, I know what I said. I meant it. But I was going to do this properly, with a ring and—" Eliza stopped him with a kiss. "I don't need properly. I just need you. Yes, Caleb Vance, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was interrupted by Thomas opening the door. "Did I miss something important?" he asked, looking between their faces. "I just asked your sister to marry me," Caleb said. "She said yes," Thomas whooped, a sound of pure joy, and pulled them both into a hug. "Best Christmas present ever," he declared. "Though, Eliza, you might have waited until I had a ring to give you. It's traditional. Since when have we been traditional?" Eliza asked, laughing through sudden tears. The Christmas social was the following evening, and all of Cedar Ridge turned out for the annual celebration. The town hall was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and the smell of Mrs. Henderson's famous spice cake filled the air. The band was tuning up, and children ran between clusters of adults, high on sugar and excitement. Eliza arrived with both Caleb and Thomas, feeling simultaneously nervous and defiant. This would be the first major social event they'd attended together since the harvest dance, and she knew the town would be watching, judging, whispering. But she also knew something they didn't yet, that she and Caleb were engaged, that they were building a future together, regardless of what anyone thought. Mrs. Henshaw was one of the first to greet them, resplendent in the green velvet dress Eliza had made. "Miss Morton, Mr. Vance, welcome. And this must be your brother Thomas." The introduction broke the ice, and slowly others approached. Some were genuinely warm, others coolly polite, but no one turned away. Deputy Brennan watched from the corner, his expression sour, but even he kept his distance. The evening unfolded with music and dancing, with laughter and conversation. Caleb danced with Eliza, and this time no one stared. Thomas charmed half the unmarried women in town with his college stories. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls that had been built between Eliza and her community began to crumble. Midway through the evening, someone called for attention. Old Samuel Hutchins stood at the front of the hall, his accordion resting against his chair, his weathered face serious. The conversations died down, and people turned to listen. "Got something to say," Samuel announced in his gravelly voice. "About one of our own." Eliza felt Caleb tense beside her. She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together, preparing for whatever was coming. 3 years ago, Caleb Vance came to this town with a past that made folks nervous. Samuel continued. "Can't blame them. We all heard what he'd done, all knew where he'd been. Prison's not something we take lightly in Cedar Ridge, but I've been watching these past 3 years, watching how he works that ranch from dawn to dusk, watching how he pays his bills on time, how he helps neighbors when they need it, how he keeps to himself and doesn't cause trouble." The room was utterly silent now. Eliza could feel her heart pounding. "Last month, my grandson's horse threw a shoe on the road near Vance's property. Horse went lame, and the boy didn't know what to do. Caleb Vance saw him, walked 2 miles to lead that horse back to my place, refused to take a cent for his time or his trouble. My grandson asked me why Mr. Vance helped him when most folks in town won't give him the time of day. You know what I told him? Samuel paused, letting the question hang in the air. I told him that character isn't about where you've been. It's about where you're going. And Caleb Vance is going in the right direction. There was a murmur of agreement from some quarters, uncomfortable silence from others. Samuel wasn't finished. Now I hear some folks have been giving Eliza Morton a hard time because she's chosen to court this man. That's not right. Eliza's been the backbone of this community for 12 years. She raised her brother after their folks passed, never asked for help, never complained. She runs an honest business, does quality work, treats everyone fairly. If she sees something worth loving in Caleb Vance, maybe we should trust her judgment instead of questioning it. Mrs. Henderson stood up, her considerable presence commanding attention. Samuel's right. I've known Eliza since she was a girl. She's got sense, and she's got heart. If she says Caleb Vance is a good man, that's good enough for me. Another voice joined in. Surprisingly, it was Mr. Henshaw, the banker. My wife told me what Caleb did last week, helping the territorial authorities track down dangerous criminals. That takes courage, especially for a man who could have just kept his head down and minded his own business. I respect that. One by one, people began to speak up. Not everyone. There were still those who remained silent, who kept their doubts and their judgments. But enough voices rose in support that Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. The town wasn't unanimous, but it was shifting, was opening a door that had been closed. Deputy Brennan stepped forward then, his face flushed. This is all well and good, but let's not forget what Vance did. He's a convicted criminal. That doesn't just go away because he helped some marshal or because he's courting a respectable woman. No, it doesn't go away, Caleb said, his voice carrying through the hall. He'd been silent until now, but he stepped forward, facing the crowd. I can't erase my past. I made terrible choices that hurt people, and I'll carry that weight for the rest of my life. But I did my time. I paid my debt to society. And for 3 years, I've tried every day to be better than I was. He turned slightly, including the whole room in his gaze. I didn't come here expecting acceptance. I came here hoping for a chance to prove myself. Some of you have given me that chance. He nodded to Samuel, to Mrs. Henderson, to a handful of others. And I'm grateful. For those of you who can't, who'll always see the criminal and never the man trying to do better, I understand. I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I'm just asking you to judge me by what I do now, not just by what I did then. He looked at Eliza, his expression softening. This woman chose me when she had every reason not to. She's faced gossip and lost business and judgment from people she's known all her life, all because she saw something in me worth taking a chance on. I don't know if I deserve her, but I'm going to spend every day trying to be worthy of that chance. The hall was absolutely quiet. Then Thomas stood up, moved to stand beside Caleb and his sister. For what it's worth, he has my approval. And my respect. Margaret stood next, joining them. Then Mrs. Henderson, then Samuel. One by one, people rose, not everyone, but more than half the room, standing in silent support of Eliza's choice, of Caleb's right to redemption, of the possibility that people could change. Eliza looked at the faces around her, seeing acceptance mixed with reservation, support mixed with doubt, but seeing mostly people willing to give someone a second chance. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't unanimous, but it was real. The minister, who'd been watching from the side, stepped forward. I think this is as good a time as any to remind everyone that it's Christmas Eve, a season of miracles, of hope, of new beginnings. Maybe we could all use a reminder that grace isn't just something we receive, it's something we give. He gestured to the band. How about some music? Let's celebrate the season and the community we're trying to build together. The band struck up a waltz, and couples began to filter onto the dance floor. Caleb turned to Eliza, offering his hand with the same formal gesture he'd used at the harvest dance 3 months ago. May I have this dance, Miss Morton? Always, she said, taking his hand. As they moved together across the floor, Eliza felt the weight of the past months finally lifting. They'd faced judgment and overcome it. They'd weathered doubt and emerged stronger. They'd proven that love could survive scrutiny, that character could overcome history. The two people who'd been standing alone could build something beautiful together. The dance ended, but Caleb didn't release her hand. Instead, he led her to the center of the floor and turned to address the crowd once more. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice steady, despite the nervousness Eliza could feel in his grip. "Earlier this week, I asked Eliza to marry me. She said yes. We'd be honored if this community would share in our joy." The silence lasted only a moment before it was broken by applause. Genuine, warm, spreading through the hall like ripples on water. Not everyone clapped, but enough did that it felt like acceptance, like permission to move forward. Thomas whooped again, and Margaret rushed forward to embrace Eliza. Mrs. Henderson produced a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. Even Mr. Henshaw offered his congratulations with what seemed like genuine pleasure. Deputy Brennan left early, his face thunderous, but Eliza barely noticed. She was too busy being pulled from one well-wisher to another, too busy watching Caleb shake hands with men who'd crossed the street to avoid him just months ago, too busy feeling the community she'd always been part of finally, fully, welcoming her choice. As midnight approached and the social began to wind down, Eliza found herself back in Caleb's arms for one last dance. The band played something slow and sweet, and they swayed together, both exhausted, both happy, both grateful for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Spring came to Cedar Ridge the way it always did, slowly at first, then all at once. The snow melted from the valley floor, revealing new grass underneath, and the aspens began their transformation from skeletal gray to vibrant green. Eliza stood on the porch of the ranch house, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. 6 months had passed since Christmas, since Thomas had given his blessing, since the town had witnessed a wedding that surprised no one, and yet felt like a miracle all the same. The small ceremony in the church had been simple, just as they'd wanted. Margaret stood beside Eliza, and Deputy Brennan beside Caleb. Thomas walked his sister down the aisle with tears in his eyes. The journalist's article had been published in February. The headline read, "The Outlaw Who Saved a Train, One Man's Path from Crime to Redemption." It was fair, honest, and surprisingly kind. Letters had come from across the territory afterward, some hateful, most supportive. The marshal Caleb had shot even wrote, explaining he'd never blamed Caleb, that he understood the impossible situation that night. Cedar Ridge had shifted too gradually, the way a river changes its course over seasons rather than days. Mrs. Henshaw had been the first to commission a dress from Eliza after the wedding, a peace offering wrapped in silk and lace. Others followed. The shop was busier now than it had been in years. Caleb emerged from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cool air, his hat pushed back on his head. He'd been up since dawn working with the horses. The Thornhill Ranch, now the Morton and Vance Ranch, was thriving. The cattle were healthy, the land productive, and they'd hired 2 ranch hands last month. He saw her on the porch and smiled, that rare, genuine smile that still made her heart skip. "Coffee's getting cold," she called out. "Then I'd better hurry," he called back, his long strides eating up the distance between them. On the porch, he kissed her forehead before taking the cup she offered. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day begin. This had become their ritual, these quiet morning moments before the work of the day pulled them in different directions. "Thomas sent another letter," Eliza said, pulling the envelope from her apron pocket. "He'll be home for the summer, bringing a young woman he wants us to meet." Caleb's eyebrows rose. "That's serious." "Sounds like it." She leaned against him and his arm came around her naturally. "Says her name is Catherine. She's studying to be a teacher." "He learned from the best," Caleb said quietly, and Eliza knew he meant her, the way she'd sacrificed to raise her brother, to give him opportunities she'd never had. "We both did," she replied, squeezing his hand. They'd learned together over these months, learning the daily work of partnership. learning when to yield and when to stand firm, when to speak and when to listen, learning that love wasn't the absence of struggle, but the commitment to struggle together. Some days were hard, some disagreements lasted past sunset, but they'd promised honesty above all else, and that honesty had become the bedrock of everything they built. The town still talked, of course. Small towns always did, but the talk had changed from condemnation to curiosity, from judgment to grudging respect. Caleb Vance had proven himself through steady work and quiet dignity. Eliza Morton had proven herself through courage and unwavering conviction. Together, they'd proven that second chances weren't just possible, they were worth fighting for. "I need to ride out to the north pasture today," Caleb said, finishing his coffee. "Should be back by supper. I'll have something waiting." She paused, then added, "Caleb? I was thinking about that empty room upstairs." He turned to look at her fully, reading her expression, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Yeah, maybe it doesn't need to stay empty." She met his gaze steadily, saw the hope and wonder there, mixed with that ever-present caution that was so much a part of him. "Eliza Morton Vance," he said softly, using her full married name the way he did when emotion overcame him. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time to think about the future, about what we're building here." She placed her hand on his chest, felt his heartbeat quicken beneath her palm. "About family." He pulled her close then, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile, though they both knew she was neither. She was strong, had always been strong, but now that strength had somewhere to rest. "I never thought I'd have this," he whispered into her hair. "A home, a wife, the possibility of more." "Neither did I," she admitted. "I thought I'd spend my life watching from the wall." He pulled back to look at her, his thumb gently brushing her cheek. "No more walls. No more walls," she agreed. The sun had fully risen now, spilling across the valley, illuminating everything in that particular light that promised new beginnings. Inside the house, Eliza's sewing machine waited in the front room they'd converted to her workspace. In the barn, Caleb's horses nickered, ready for the day's work. On the ridge above the ranch, that spot where they'd first kissed, wildflowers were beginning to bloom. They'd both been standing alone for so long, convinced that loneliness was their lot, their penance, their fate. Then one night, at a harvest dance, someone had been brave enough to cross a floor. Someone had been brave enough to say yes. Everything that came after, the judgment, the revelation, the struggle, the choice, had led them here to this porch, to this morning, to this moment of quiet joy. Caleb kissed her once more, tender and full of promise, before heading back to work. Eliza watched him go. This man who'd asked her to dance, this man who'd changed everything. Then she turned to face her own day, her own work, her own piece of the life they were building together. Above the door, the new sign swayed gently in the morning breeze. Morton and Vance, two names, two histories, two hearts that had found each other against all odds. Some stories end with a dance. This one began there and would continue, day by day, season by season, in all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make a life. And that, as it turned out, was more than enough.